Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute seminar. Thank you for coming at 10 a.m. Our usual seminar time is at noon, but the School of Computing needed to have a faculty meeting at noon today, so we needed to move this a little earlier. So we're very happy to have Timo Heister here, who is visiting us from Clemson University, and he's going to give a talk on adaptive and scalable solvers for finite element problems. So please join me in welcoming Timo to the University of Utah.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming. I'm an assistant professor at Clemson, and I wasn't quite sure about the audience, so let me figure this out really quickly. Some of you are graduate students, I assume? Okay. Who of you are more in the visualization or data analysis on the analysis side? Who's familiar with finite element computations? Mostly all of you. Okay. I'll still try to go over the basics to make sure that everybody follows along. So I'm sorry for those of you for whom that is very basic, but I thought that would be a better idea. That's also why the title is somewhat generic. I would like to acknowledge my sponsors, and there's too many people to list that collaborate with me on all kinds of different projects, so I'm not listing them on slide one. I hope I can point them out during the talk. And before I get started, I was somewhat scared that my visualizations are not quite up to the standard here, so I'm sorry about that. I hope you can live with that. To give you some context, when I started out working on my PhD, I was mostly working in fluid dynamics and I'm concerned about how do you discretize, especially incompressible flow equations. Well, I got my PhD in Göttingen in Germany, which is, I guess, well known for fluids. Prandtl was there, for example. And I was interested in the combination of how do we do the discretization right, and how does that interact with efficient solvers. And then doing that, I came to working on a finite element library called DL2, which is something I'll be talking about a little bit more in a minute. But that meant that I was working more on more foundational stuff, a lot more software development, and which is kind of one of the main things I do these days, is that I see myself as somebody who provides the foundation to solve PDEs numerically to other people from other fields, and I enable other people to do their computations. Through that, I'm exposed to many different applications, and I will point out some of them during my talk. But that makes life interesting, I guess. That applications, have certain needs for solvers, efficiency, and so on. All right. What I want to mention is the DL2 library. That's probably what I'm known best for, what I do. So it's a large community-driven project, open source, written in C++, high performance. I'm one of the 4 main people, I guess. We have about 10 to 12 main developers, and 4 of us are more concerned also about the running the project and all kinds of testing infrastructure and so on and so on. It is widely used. We're tracking the number of papers that use DL2, and currently it's about 1,000 scientific publications all across the world that cite DL2 as using it for their computations. I think what we're good at is documentation. I'm not sure that many of the other things are things that set the library apart, but there's interesting features that you can use in large-scale computations, where you can do isogeometric mappings. That's kind of the bridge between finite elements and isogeometric analysis, PDEs on surfaces, and so on, and everything, or most of it, on adaptively refined meshes in large scale. And I will talk a little bit about that because that's what I'm interested in. So the 30-second what is the finite element method, it's a numerical method to solve partial differential equations, and the easiest thing I can write down is a Laplace equation, right, which models something like a heat distribution in some domain with some force on the right-hand side. So you solve for the Laplace of u equal to a given f with some kind of boundary condition, and you might have a solution like there over to the right, where you have a heat distribution inside the body that you heat up, or it might be a membrane under gravity or whatever other simple potential, physical potential. So what you do is you generate a weak form, which means multiplying by a test function, integrating over the domain. I guess I wrote it as an inner product, which is not particularly easy to understand if you haven't seen that before. But basically what you then do is you have your domain, you chop it up into tiny triangles, quadrilaterals, or other shapes, and then on each of them you use a polynomial approximation. And then you stitch them together, and then you get a basis function that's a finite dimensional space. And if you go through that, then you end up with a linear system of equations where entries are basically just inner products, so integrals over shape functions. And then you can solve them, and then you have numerical approximation of the solutions. And that helps you to solve all kinds of PDEs that come from physics, biology, engineering, and so on and so on. Okay? So in short, we can cook down a PDE where we're looking for a function u down to solving a linear system. And the question is, how do we solve these, right? So if I have a system AX equal B, there are a lot of problems associated with that. So the systems can become quite large. These days, so on the right there's a geoscience application of a code I'm involved in writing. And what you kind of want is, if this is the Earth, the mantle is the region between the core and the crust that we simulate. You want something like a 1 kilometer resolution, which would be hundreds of billions of elements if you actually want to resolve that everywhere. So that would mean in every time step I would need to solve a linear system of that size. So it gets kind of expensive. We use adaptivity, so it's not that bad, but we are still in the order of hundreds of millions of unknowns. And of course, what do? Well, parallel computing obviously comes to mind. And A, to make things faster, and B, because I couldn't even fit a solution onto one of these machines, right? You're probably aware that the largest clusters are in the order of millions, of course, but you also should care about this because even your cell phone has, I don't know, 4 cores or 8 cores or something like that, or my laptop. Okay, so how do we do that? The very basic way of talking about parallel computing is just to see it in a very abstract manner, that I wire together a bunch of computers. They might have several cores, which is complicated. They have their own separate memory, so they run their own software, and the only thing I can do is I can send and receive data that's standardized as, for example, the message passing interface. I assume that you've heard of this, but just to give the context. So that's of course only part of the story, right? That's the easiest story. But if I want to run on a supercomputer, that's one of the ways to do that. And of course, now I need to figure out how can I make numerical algorithms that are amenable to this? How do I implement them? How do I make that scalable? And how do I make that work? That I can actually solve bigger problems and that I can actually do that quickly enough. Okay? So when you think about this scaling to hundreds or thousands or 10,000s or 100,000s of cores, what you need to do is obviously distribute all the data storage. So every data structure you have to figure out how do you distribute it, and how do you still manage to express everything that you need to express. So you need special data structures to do that. And of course, you want your algorithms, they have to work on these distributed data structures, so you don't have the knowledge, for example, of the whole geometry or the whole solution or the whole system matrix, or and so on and so on. So they need to operate on this, and they should not depend on the total problem size, because that's something we want to grow, right, for scalability. And of course, the problem is communication, because that's the thing that doesn't scale. If I have work that I can split up, I can scale that to larger work sizes. I can make the problem size bigger, or to more processors. But the thing that does not scale is communication. It doesn't get faster if communicating an answer doesn't get faster if I have more processors, right? So the only thing I can hope for is that I localize communication, as in I don't have every of the 100,000 cores talk to each other all the time. And the second thing is that I hide them. So what that means is that I'm sending off a message, and then while I do that, I do computations, right? And if I do that, then the timing doesn't matter, and it doesn't break my scalability. So in general, that's, I guess, kind of the summary of what I need. So let me tell you a little bit what I did during my PhD. So that was basically, so that's a paper in, I guess, 2011. So what we were doing is, how do you take this very simple model? I have A is equal B. How do I, in general, make this work for how to run this in parallel? Okay. And so the motivation here is a cutout again of a geoscience application. That's like a you see these hot plumes rising from the bottom because the core is hot, right? And then you also have cold downwellings, and you have very localized solution, right? So you have very sharp gradients here of the temperature in these small channels that you have to resolve. And so the solution here is symmetric, and you see the adaptively refined mesh that during the computation follows the features. And obviously the solution is very smooth here, so I don't need to resolve it very accurately. Whereas here I can go down to a very high resolution to resolve all these features. The problem here is, of course, I make a time step, and that plume is going to be no longer here, but it's going to be up there, right? So I need to quickly adapt my mesh, refine and coarsen in the appropriate places, redistribute the workload, and then solve the next time step, right? And the goal for this that we had is, for the user, the principle is it should be equivalent to, this is a simple problem I can run on my one computer, right? So not only from the programming perspective, from the implementation perspective, but also from the algorithm perspective. Can we make that work that I don't have to worry about other things, right? Can we run the algorithms in parallel and make that work? So we were building on, because we need very fast way to partition this mesh, because we have to split up the work. So each cell is owned by a processor, so I have to do that quickly, every couple of time steps. And so what we decided to do was we built on a library called pforest that came out of the group of Omagatas in Austin a while ago. I was still in Texas, so that was a close drive to there. And what it basically is if I have a mesh, for example, think of this whole box here as the core cell, and if I refine this into 4 children and then take the first child and refine it again, I might have this adaptively refined mesh that I want to compute on. I can represent this as a tree, right? So this tree structure represents this adaptively refined mesh. And I can just traverse this here from left to right, and that's a space-filling curve, which is the one in red. And obviously, that's a little bit too simple. In reality, I actually need more than one, because my course measures more than one cell. So if I have 4 or 3 cells at the beginning, then each of them gives me a tree like this. So I have a collection of trees, so I have a forest. Okay? And this library is very efficient in dealing with these forests. And what we basically tell the library is, hey, this is how we want to refine our mesh, and then they can answer with, what is the neighborship relationship, how do I repartition it efficiently, and so on. And, well, how does that work? I can even show you how that works. Let's say I have 2 processors. I just chop the space-filling curve into 2 more or less equally sized pieces, and then it immediately gives me a partition. That's not the optimal way to partition, but that's an NP hard graph partitioning problem I don't want to solve, right? But this is already pretty good. And what we then do is we basically say, okay, thanks for telling me what is my area of interest, and then each node knows how to construct the local mesh and then do the operations locally. Right? Of course, things are a bit more complicated. So here's an example where I randomly refine into a mesh and color it with partition it for 3 processors, so red, yellow, and blue. And this is the logical global mesh that doesn't exist anywhere. And at the bottom, you see the 3 you see the, I hope you can understand me. You see the 3 local areas, so each processor knows about their own cells, and then like one ghost layer around. But red doesn't know about that stuff down here. So you have to have the data structures to do that. But if you do that, I mean, that looks at least simple enough. Then basically you have most of what you need for a finite element computation. So I partition the cells, I color them by processor, right? I have to somehow number degrees of freedom. Namely, these are the, if you think of the finite element method just as I get a set of basis functions, then they correspond, I have to number them. And if I number them globally in the correct way that everybody knows how that works, I can basically assemble the linear system as if it would live on one processor, right? There's some local communication, of course, that happens on like the interfaces. But conceptually, you can take up your linear system and you chop it up basically in blocks of rows, distribute the storage between the processors, and then you have a distributed linear system that you can solve. Well, if you have solvers. So then, how do you solve linear systems? Well, if you can hand this to your favorite linear algebra library. There's Petsy, there's Tridinos, there's others that can deal with this. Well, you hope, I guess. But the cool thing is that iterative methods can be parallelized, right? So if you read up on a conjugate gradient method, you basically need scalar products and matrix vector products. Well, guess what? You can also do them in parallel, right? So you can run a CG, which is equivalent to running it in serial on as many nodes as you want. The only bad news is that you need a preconditioner for that, right? Iterative methods without preconditioners don't work. And so I guess that's the struggle. And I think the only thing where we can actually hope for optimal scalability, what do I mean by this, is that the total complexity to solve a linear system Ax equal b with n unknowns, that this is not only O of n, so the time it takes is proportional to the number of unknowns. I want this because otherwise if I go to billions of unknowns, I'm lost, right, if it's only a little bit worse. And I also want this scalable as in I want to chop up the work between P processors, ideally optimally, right? So the short answer is, or the short message is, if I have an algebraic multigrid, for example, that I can use as a black box, right? That experts that I, as the finite element guy, don't have to worry about because other people have figured that out much smarter than I am. Then you can actually have an optimally scaling method. For those of you who are not in the area of finite elements, let me point out that the whole success of the finite element method is built on the fact that you can solve a problem with n unknowns in O of n time. That's the whole goal, how we built this, right? So, and you can go back in any place if you make a mistake. For example, if your basis functions don't have local support, you immediately don't have sparse matrices, you have not O of n entries in your matrix, you immediately cannot be O of n time, right? Because storage has to be O of n, because otherwise it wouldn't work. And in every step in between, right? And people work really hard on all ends, basically. How I set up things, how I mesh, how do I assemble the linear systems, how do I use the iterative solvers, and all of them are made so that hopefully we can be close to O of n time. Yeah. Okay, so how does that look like? That's been a while ago, that picture. But so this is a strong scaling plot. So on the x-axis is number of processors to 16,000, and that's like a fixed problem size of 300 million unknowns. So it's just a linear system, 300 million by 300 million. On the y-axis is the wall time, and you see the nice scaling thing of all the of all the operations that I'm not even going to explain to you. The only thing that looks really terrible is the linear solver. And it scales a little bit, but it depends totally on the local distribution. And you can also see that on the very right, you hit the problem that the algebraic multigrid does not scale anymore. So maybe this is not the answer. Maybe that was the answer 10 years ago and was good enough to do 10 years ago, but that's not good enough, right? So I hope that was clear as the one step you can do, and I can solve on 10,000 processors and I can solve big problems, but that's not good enough. So why can I not use algebraic multigrid? And so now I'm getting a little bit more into the computer science aspect of this. By definition, the way an algebraic multigrid works is that you look at the sparse matrix, that is the product that you hand over to the library, and they look at the sparse matrix. And that immediately means that you're in trouble because these days processors are much faster in computing things than accessing memory. So if I just do sparse matrix vector products, I'm at like 1% utilization of the CPU itself, right? So the arithmetic intensity is much too low. So that's a problem. These days, we can talk about how exactly the future is going to look like, but it's certainly obvious that even normal processors go more and more towards other levels of parallelism. So you have vectorization in CPUs to do one instruction on several entities of data, and you have multi-threading, hyper-threading, or whatever. So more and more cores on a single die. And that's difficult to exploit if you build things on sparse matrices, right? I think the biggest problem of algebraic multigrid is that you have to reconstruct cursor levels by looking at the matrix structure, and you have to do a lot of communication and you have a lot of setup cost because of that. I'll talk a little bit more how multigrid exactly works in a minute. And it also doesn't take advantage of the geometric information, basically, that I have, right? I have a mesh that is refined, and I'm throwing that away. AMG is really good for Laplace or Poisson type problems, but it's much harder to exploit like PDE-specific things. On the other hand, it's easy. People have done it, so I can just point my library at it, and it works. You might have heard of Trilinos ML, for example. So can we do better? What I want, if I can make a wish list, I want this to be general purpose. I want this to be flexible. I can use any kind of finite element method. I want to be able to do adaptivity very rapidly. I want this to be efficient and scalable. And again, I don't know how the future looks like. I don't know if it goes towards Xeon Phis in that direction, more towards GPUs or more general purpose CPUs. But I think we can agree on that it's very likely that we get more cores, less memory bandwidth. And what that means for me is we need to use higher order methods because they are more intensive, arithmetically speaking. I don't want to build matrices. And I need to be able to be very flexible with respect to parallel computing, right? From low-level vectorization up to between-node communication. And so what I'm getting at is that we need to go to geometric multigrid instead of algebraic multigrid. At least that is my opinion, and I will try to convince you about this in the next minutes. So what is this multigrid I'm talking about? Very, very simple sketch is the following. Ignore the coloring of the meshes on the right, but if you want to solve a problem on the mesh on the top there, what you do is you have a hierarchy of cheaper and cheaper to solve problems, and you solve the same problem on a very coarse mesh, and you inform the solution on the higher on the mesh that you're actually interested in, right? And so how it works is you basically have this is a picture of a V-cycle, so you have a correction. You basically transform the residual down to the coarsest mesh. You solve there, and that informs the solution going back to the finest solution. You have to do not only the transfer, but you also have to apply smoothers. Why is that? What I basically do is I have residual on this level And I can only represent this on this level if it is a smooth function. Otherwise, by going to the coarser solution, I lose all the information. And so the main difficulty is I have to smoothen the residual before going down. I also have to do the same while going up. Okay? And algebraic multigrid works in a similar way, except that all of this is done on a matrix level, right? You construct sparse matrices, and you do your smoothing and your restriction based on only on like the algebraic thing. But I have something like this. I have a hierarchy of meshes, right? If I refine them, I actually do have a hierarchy. Why don't I use this? Okay, and that's what I call geometric multigrid. So I have a sequence of meshes, and I have a sequence of finite element spaces, so I can have a sequence of auxiliary problems like this, right? I don't want to get too much into the smoothers, but you can think of it as some kind of relaxation that I do. What's done in the theory is like so if you solve AU equal G, then that's the residual, right? And you can just dampen it by the spectral radius. You can do all kinds of simple diagonal approximation, inverse of the diagonal or whatever, or you can get more fancy. I think what's typically done is something like Gauss-Seidel methods, or I think the whole theory of Schwartz problems, where you decompose your operations as a collection of smaller problems. This can be cells, patches, or any kind of local problem, and you can either additively or multiplicatively combine them. Okay? So these are smoothers. And then writing down the multigrid algorithm is actually quite simple. So if I need to solve a system AX equal G, I apply a smoother, and then I recursively do the V cycle of the residual by transforming down, by computing the residual and then moving it down one level until I'm at the coarse level. On the coarsest level, it's easy to solve. And the only thing I need is some kind of transfer, right? And I don't think I need to go into too much detail here. Okay, so the resolution didn't show all the lines of the mesh. So this is all fine and good, but now I actually have an adaptively refined mesh, because my region of interest is actually refined somewhere. So how do I do this? Because if I go back, this is a nice hierarchy, and I know how to do transfers and so on, and this has been done for many years. But if you do it adaptively, that's a bit more difficult. You also don't want to do too much work, as in you don't want to smoothen and transfer and do all the work if I don't even have refined cells there, right? I only want to do the work where I do this. So this is based on work done by two colleagues of mine, Bärbel and Guido in Heidelberg at that time. And basically, they construct a multigrid method based on local smoothing, and I'll explain a little bit how that works. Same theory, you have a sequence of adaptively refined meshes, right? And you have a nested set of finite element spaces, and I can write down the multigrid method in exactly the same way. But if I am on a certain mesh, one of these adaptively refined meshes, you realize that if I have a basis for this, I can decompose that space basically on all the cells that are newly introduced on that level, and then all the cells, the remainder, basically, right? It's a bit more complicated if I use continuous finite elements because I have to take care of the interface between the two different levels. I don't want to go too much into detail into that, but if I can compute smoothing and restriction and computing residuals on this whole thing, I can basically reproduce the normal multigrid method. I, of course, only do this logically because I don't want to do all the extra work. Okay? So logically, it's just a normal global multigrid method, but I only work where I have to. So if I decompose my space or my linear systems, I can basically split them up. So I have a block matrix with blocks that are strictly on the level, that are on the interface, or that are on the lower level, and I don't need to do anything on the lower level. And then from the combinations of these, it depends on the kind of method that you have. So if you have a discontinuous finite element method, you have fluxes in blue, otherwise they disappear. And then these other blocks are basically interfaces to the other levels. And then you can basically go back and like redo the whole method. And I'll just give you an example. For example, if I have a solution vector, I need to apply a smoother. I just don't do anything on the interface. I don't do anything on the lower level, and I just apply the smoother to the cell strictly on that level, right? And that's a good idea because it's the smallest amount of work that I can do. And I can do this the same for restriction operators, for example, where I don't need to do anything if it's on the lower level because it's actually identical. Okay? So I have a residual on the whole space, but I actually don't compute with that. I never need anything on the lower levels, so all of the things are local. It's also quite convenient. The data structures become very simple because I only have to deal with these local areas. There's no hanging nodes, and so on. And the interfaces are basically boundary conditions. So you might ask, do I get back to O of n? Can I solve, because that's the main attractiveness of geometric multigrid. You can look up the proof for if you have a significant good enough smoother, I guess, then you can show that the total complexity of solving using multigrid is O of n. And then you actually see that in practice. It's not just theoretical. It actually does work. So how about if I do adaptive refinement, right? If I have a mesh like this is the total number gives me the total number of unknowns. Let's say I have piecewise linear functions on this mesh. Can I solve this in O of n time? The answer is not quite. You get it in the sum over the number of unknowns over all the levels. And there's like a hypothetical case, if you just keep refining into one corner, then you're adding a fixed number of degrees of freedom in each level step, and then you don't have that basically the geometric series works out to converge to a constant factor, but then you're worse. But this is still quasi-optimal. This is as good as we can get. And in practice, we don't compute with infinitely many levels and infinite number of unknowns, but it kind of breaks down in that way, right? Otherwise, the method works identical to a normal geometric multigrid that you know. You can use all kinds of smoothers, and everything works out. So just to convince you that that works, you don't have to look at all the numbers, but so this is just a conjugate gradient for a 3D problem, like a block SSOR, different finite element degrees, different refinements, so global refinement, refining into a quadrant, different refinement levels, and if you just look at the N10, this is the number of CG iterations I need to get the residual down by 10 orders of magnitude, and you see it's constant and constant that way, so everything is good, right? And so the operations I do is O of n, and I need a constant number of iterations on different refinement levels. So this works, even adaptively refined, everything seems to be good. That also works for discontinuous Galerkin methods. Here the iteration numbers are a little bit higher, but you still see it's like 14, 15. Doesn't matter. Polynomial degree works and refinement works. Yeah? Oh, for the refinement. That is a good question, yes. So to explain to you, what we do is we enforce a 2-to-1 relationship going over an edge. So we don't have arbitrary things matching. I don't know. Let's see. I would think that the multigrid method itself doesn't care, that it's more a question of like the approximation properties of the finite element method itself. Because these are interface conditions, so they are fixed in the multigrid sense. I don't think that breaks down, but I don't know, to be honest. We enforce that because it's much easier to handle. Okay, again, let's continue. That was in serial, right? How do we make this work in parallel? Okay, and so this is a work with two colleagues in Germany and one of my students, Konrad Cavender. And the idea is, well, can we take all of this that I just explained to you? How do I make this work at large scale in parallel? All right? And the idea is, well, let's try to be equivalent. So I want to reproduce exactly those numbers. All right? Logically, the transfer is like a multiplication with a rectangular matrix. So I have my solution vector on one level, I have it on the next level, multiply by a rectangular matrix, and that gives me a transfer, or in the transpose of that, the transfer in the other direction. I can do that in parallel. Okay, that's easy. Smoothers, well, I can do the same thing I do in serial, provided they're additive smoothers. Because a multiplicative smoother, my solution in some area of domain depends on the intermediate result. If I have an SSOR or a Gauss-Seidel or something, depends on that. That is sequential, and I cannot do this in parallel. But if I have a simple enough smoother that does not depend on what the other processors are doing, I can be equivalent to the serial computation. I can mix those, but that's maybe beyond what I want to talk about today. I need to solve a coarse system. That might be an issue. But one thing we can do is we can switch to something like an algebraic multigrid on a coarse enough level, where the setup cost is not too expensive. So we can kind of do that, right? You can probably agree that this is just now an exercise on how do we partition things, and that's the difficult part. I have to distribute work, and the work changes because the mesh regions locally refined are different on each level. So how do I distribute the work evenly and efficiently and not communicate like crazy, right? Because I only want to communicate a little. So we thought about this a little bit. If you think about this mesh that I already showed you, this time split up between 3 processors. That's the space filling curve on the left. The coloring is the processor who owns the cells. And that's the linear system I want to solve. Okay? Or that's the cells that I want to solve on. If I write this down as a hierarchy of levels, I get these 3 levels of adaptively refined meshes. And the question is, that's the tree representation of that. And the question is, how do I split up the work on the individual levels, right? Because our distribution right now on the active level is somewhat fair. Each of them has 2 or 3. So all the the leaves here have 2 or 3 cells per processor. But how do I do this on the lower levels, right? So I have to decide who does the smoothing on this cell, okay? And well, first and simple idea is I just give it to whoever owns the first child. So first child is owned by red, I give it to red. First child of this is red, so I give it to red. This is very simple. It is attractive in the sense that it's a very simple rule. I don't have to do any partitioning. It is neat because in general, it's often the case that I don't have to communicate a lot because one, if not all children have the same owner. So this is just a local version. But you can immediately see that this work is not evenly split between processors, right? So on this level, if I do a smoothing step, green has nothing to do. If I'm on this level, only red has something to do. Okay, I can't do better here, but if it was you, you would probably say, oh, maybe I could give this to green because then everybody has something to do on this level, right? So it's not optimal. And the question that I had was, that I let my student figure out is, well, how is this imbalance? How bad is it? Especially if I run larger computations, I don't know how significant that is. I'm not going to do multigrid on 7 cells, right? So just to give you an example of how this looks like. So on the left is the theoretical view of the global mesh, and then it's split between 2 processors, and then the ownership is colored on each level, so you can see, maybe convince yourself that this is how it works, that is the first child rule. So I don't know. Here, the first child is this, so this is colored as that, and so on. More complicated maybe, so like this is the picture you've seen earlier. And you also see that the views of the individual processors, so this processor doesn't know about the mesh in that corner, right? Because I don't want to duplicate that data. So I have a perfect distribution on the leaf mesh, and all of this might work, but I have some kind of work imbalance. So how does that look like? Before I talk about the imbalance, let's just look at if the method works. So this is a discontinuous Galerkin simple Laplace problem in an L-shaped domain where I have a singularity, so I want to refine into it. And it doesn't matter on how many processes I run, it's equivalent, right? So it's a geometric multigrid method that's independent of the processors. When I look at this, I can actually confirm this. So this is a very simple example where these green boxes are smoother steps between 4 processors, and that's time. And you see this processor doesn't have anything to do here and waits. and then on a different level, the processor has more to do than that processor, for example. So in this bad example, you can see that this is terrible because processors are idle, because they have to wait until they can work on the next level after the transfer is done. So I can actually look at the workload, and I can define an optimal workload by saying, well, ideally, I have work proportional to the number of unknowns on that level, and I just split them evenly between the number of processors. And then that gives me, and I assume I have to wait for the slowest one, and then I have basically an imbalance between the two, right? It's the sum of the work on each level that I actually do compared to the optimal one, which would be if I had a way to optimally split work between all of them. And I can look at these workloads, and if I have global refinement, so these are now all plots of this factor, this ratio. On the x-axis is number of processors, colors are different number of different meshes. You can see if I do global refinement, the ratio is 1, right? I'm normal multigrid, everybody's busy, everything works. If I do something adaptively refined, you'll see that the ratio increases, but it seems to be like dropping off at about 2. It gets a little bit higher, but these are actually problems that have they're dashed here because they have very few number of cells left on a processor. So if I have 8,000 processors and I have 200,000 cells, that's a quite small problem. And then processors drop out and the ratio seems to grow more. And I can do this for all kinds of problems. I can do this in 3D. The ratio is a little bit higher, but it's still like below the factor of 4 or whatever. And so now I can actually do a computation. So this is a strong scaling, again, a Laplace problem, adaptively or both. So blue is a line that's 100 million unknowns. So blue is a globally refined thing that should work perfectly, and green is an adaptively refined mesh. And the cool thing I can do is I can compute this work ratio, and the optimal scaling of the strong scaling is the black line. And if I just take this one blue globally refined data point for 100 million unknowns and now scale it with this factor that I can compute, that gives me the red line. You'll probably see that the red line is not quite straight because the work ratio changes and gets worse the more processors I have because the problem size is fixed. But this gives us a surprisingly good model for the green line, right? So the red line doesn't know anything about the green adaptive computation. And I was quite happy when I saw that we actually track this data very well. And so, well, if your adaptively refined mesh predicts a 3 times increase in workload for you can do adaptive computation, then that's actually what you see. Okay? Of course, it's going to be a little bit worse. You have to pay a little bit for adaptivity, but you can gain a lot through adaptivity, right? I can probably get the same accuracy with 100x fewer degrees of freedom if I do adaptive refinement, and I pay a factor of 4 over global refinement. So that's a win-win, right? So I can look at number of processors that drop out. On the lower levels, you see processors drop out. Don't want to go into this. And I can use this. So this is work mostly done by Martin Kronbichler in Munich in Germany. You can do all this matrix-free. So you don't assemble any matrices. All your operations built on fast tensor evaluation. So you can use vectorization. You can use hyperthreading. You can use MPI. And we can get very large memory savings because we don't have to store matrices. The biggest thing we store is now solution vectors. Smoothers are a little bit limited, but we can do higher order finite elements in 3D, strong and weak scaling in a single plot here, and you see problem sizes up to hundreds of billions of unknowns that I can solve very quickly. So this is very attractive, and we can do this on adaptively refined meshes, right? So that's very encouraging. So here it's 100,000 cores on the SuperMOOC in Munich, continuous, discontinuous, different orders, and so on. So that's kind of the story that this works. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So with matrix-free computations, you have a sweet spot, and it kind of depends on exactly where it pays off, I guess. So if you have linear elements, it's probably comparable or a little bit worse than matrix-based things. But in the Q3 range, you're beating sparse matrix-based solutions. That was not really the point of the slide. I can do any degree you want. The question is, like, what is the fastest time to solution based on your finite element error? And that depends on your problem, right? But I mean, yes, matrix-free computations are better the higher the degree is, whatever you can afford, right? But I think something like degree 3 polynomials is not, I don't know, is something you could say that makes sense for applications, even if the solutions are not smooth. Yeah. Okay. Of course, we don't want to solve Laplace problems. So here are a few pictures. This is like a linear elasticity where we are much better than an algebraic multigrid, even if we tell them this is a linear elasticity problem with this null space and whatever. We have problems getting the AMG to converge. Right? It's a higher order DG discretization. I don't have a lot of data here that I can show you, but it's a work in progress. I've been doing this also or started to do this with Borg smoothers for Stokes and other fluid flow problems. But let me move on a little bit. I want to show, or want to leave you with at least the philosophy of what happens if you go to realistic problems. Because in reality, it's not Poisson problems what multigrid methods are made for. You often have a combination of convection and diffusion. Well, diffusion is Laplace-like, so that's good. But another challenge is that you have very heterogeneous coefficients. If you think of the Earth, you have 6 orders of magnitude jumps in coefficients, and that's a challenge. But I mean, I think the bigger challenge is you have coupled PDEs, right? I don't have just a scalar variable. And I guess, in my opinion, you have two options. Option one is you sit down and do a block factorization of your PDE. I'll show you an example in a second. And then you apply multigrid on individual blocks and hope that that works, that they are Laplace-like. And the option two is you figure out smoothers for that work for the monolithic problem and do multigrid on the whole thing. They are then problem-specific. You might have heard of Vanka smoothers, for example, which is probably one of the earliest or most prominent examples where you can do it for fluid flow problems. But for higher order methods, you have to do higher order patches and so on. So here's an example of the aspect finite element code to do geoscience computation. This is a Stokes flow, and I'm just plotting here the viscosity. In this example, this is like 4 orders of magnitude, how it varies inside the Earth. And that's very challenging. So a typical problem here is about 100 million unknowns that you have to solve fully implicitly. Stokes flow. So if you have Stokes flow, just to give you an example, you can split up your linear system in that sense. Right? You have the velocity block, and B transverse, or B is the gradient of the pressure or the divergence constraint. And you precondition this thing by just saying, oh, I make a Gauss elimination of this block system that gives me a preconditioner like this. And the only problem is I have to approximate that Schur complement because I need the inverse of A. I cannot form that, so I have to approximate that. So what do we do right now? For example, for A inverse, I do a V cycle, and S needs to be approximated, for example, using a scaled mass matrix or something more sophisticated depending on the problem. Right? And so you have inner solves, but you basically decompose things until you can apply multigrid. That gets more complicated for a Navier-Stokes flow. That's where I worked on during my PhD a lot. You again have a similar linear system, but you have a convective term in here. So your velocity block is not Laplace-like. And then things get more difficult. Not only the A block is harder to solve, but also the Schur complement is more complicated. I'm going to skip that, but the bottom line is that I can approximate, that I can use stabilization schemes that actually also improve the numerical linear algebra. So I can approximate the Schur complement better by adding a stabilization that improves the solution. I did that a while ago. And that helps me to solve Navier-Stokes incompressible flow problems. There's another thing where I want to apply this, and I haven't done geometric multigrid on this yet. This is for crack propagation in like elastic media. So you have an elasticity problem, but you also have cracks forming. And when you do that and you discretize that, you want to do these computations on adaptively refined meshes, because you need to resolve the cracks very, very neatly, but you don't care about the rest of the area. And so we came up with a way to do adaptive refinement in a clever way. The problem is that the cracks grow very rapidly, and so I have to actually do like a predictor corrector scheme that is visible here. And when you do that, you can actually, let's hope that works. So this is a picture of a picture. That's a movie. It's a movie where I'm applying pressure inside these two cracks, and then they start to grow. And the background color is the mesh, and it's also the heterogeneous material. So you can see branching and merging of cracks forming in this movie. And that works adaptively. And then now the question is, how do I solve this efficiently in parallel? The good news is, again, I can split up things, and I have Laplace-like operators where I can apply multigrid too, and that allows me to solve things on 100 million unknowns, which I actually do need, because in this benchmark, to get some kind of error in the 1% range or lower, I need an adaptively refined mesh with 100 million unknowns. And that's not tractable at all in a globally refined mesh. So I can do 3D computations adaptively refined very quickly. And that's kind of promising in that sense. Okay, I hope that gave you a little bit of a perspective on how I see how you can do that for more complicated applications. And I guess to leave you with the conclusions is that it's hard work to make this O of n over p work, but that's really what we have to work on to solve large-scale problems, and you actually do need that to solve problems with billions of unknowns. And I showed you one possible solution, which is you use geometric multigrid that works on adaptively refined meshes. If you go matrix-free, I think we are also good in the future, not only today, but also tomorrow. And this is possible to do in some kind of generic way. So whatever kind of application I have, if I can apply local smoothers and they're somewhat problem relevant, I can do that. And going further, I think patch-based smoothers are the way to go if we figure out how to do them efficiently. That's all I have. Thank you.